What truly drives our economies? I mean, is it just, a relentless pursuit of personal gain?
Or could there be something more fundamental at play, something that kind of glues our interactions together?
Exactly. Today, we're diving deep into precisely this question, and we're doing it inspired by the book On the Economics of Respect, The Reciprocity of Due Consideration for the Needs of Others by D.S. Matthews.
What's so compelling about Matthew's work, I think, is that he flips the traditional economic script. He argues that genuine economic progress isn't just about, well, polite gestures.
Right.
It hinges on a core principle, actively considering and acting upon the needs of others. This, he contends, is the bedrock of trust that our economies are actually built upon.
Yeah, absolutely. And this isn't your typical book review. Think of it as us trying to unpack a really powerful idea. Our main source is Matthew's book itself. And our mission today is to really understand his central argument, look at the evidence he presents. Can looking through this lens of respect give us a fresh perspective on how economies work, and maybe even how they could work better?
That's the goal.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. When Matthews talks about respect in an economic context, he's not just talking about saying please and thank you, right? What does he really mean?
You've hit on a crucial point there. He immediately distinguishes his definition from mere social courtesy. He defines economic respect as due consideration for the needs of others.
Due consideration for the needs of others.
It's about genuinely taking those needs into account.
That sounds straightforward enough, but he digs deeper, doesn't he? Talking about superficiality and just kind of going through the motions.
He does. He points out that we can have all the outward signs of politeness, the superficial courtesy, right? But underneath it all, there might be a complete lack of regard for someone's actual needs or their contributions.
I see.
And then there's compliance, just following social norms simply to avoid, getting in trouble, not because of a genuine concern for others. What's fascinating is this gap he points out between outward behavior and the underlying intent.
So it's not enough to just be outwardly polite or follow the rules. Matthews wants us to think about something more profound here.
Absolutely. He emphasizes that the crucial element is acting on the consideration. It's about translating that awareness of someone else's needs into tangible actions.
Tangible actions. Like what?
Well, that could be offering assistance, providing support, or even consciously deciding not to do something that would cause harm. It's that crucial step from intention to concrete behavior.
And he's careful to differentiate this from related ideas like tolerance and empathy. What's the key difference there in his view?
That's right. Tolerance is more about accepting the existence of differences, maybe putting up with them, but it doesn't necessarily imply valuing the perspectives or contributions of those who are different. Respect, in Matthew's view, goes beyond mere acceptance. It involves actively valuing what others bring to the table.
And empathy.
Well, empathy, understanding, and sharing someone else's feelings is certainly related, very important. But respect requires taking that understanding and channeling it into action. Empathy can be a starting point, definitely, but respect demands a tangible response.
Okay, so let me try to sum up Matthew's definition then. Economic respect is truly considering others' needs and then acting on that consideration. It's more than just surface-level politeness or compliance or tolerance or even just feeling empathy.
That's a great summary.
So what's the big insight we get from this more nuanced understanding of respect? Why does it matter economically?
The core insight, according to Matthews, is that this deeper form of respect is what truly underpins trust, cooperation, and reciprocity, that essential give and take that drives economic activity. Ultimately, he argues, this is the engine of economic prosperity and overall societal well-being. Think about it. When we genuinely consider each other's needs, we create a foundation for people to work together effectively. Trust blossoms.
Now, if respect is this crucial, this fundamental building block, why has it been so overlooked in a lot of traditional economic thinking? That's what Matthews delves into next, right? Chapter 1.2.
Exactly. Matthews directly addresses this neglect of respect in mainstream economics. He points out how traditional models have largely focused on self-interest and efficiency as the primary motivators.
The old Homo economicus.
Precisely. The classic Homo economicus model, the purely rational actor always striving to maximize their own personal gain, doesn't really have a space for genuine consideration of others' needs as an inherent driver. It's kind of bolted on, if at all.
And he brings up the limitations of utilitarianism, which is such a dominant framework in welfare economics. What's his take on that?
What's fascinating here is his critique. While utilitarianism aims to maximize the overall happiness or well-being of society, Matthews argues that it can be blind to how that well-being is distributed.
How so?
Well, a policy might increase total happiness in a society, technically, but if it does so by significantly benefiting some at the expense of others, particularly the most vulnerable, Matthews suggests this could be seen as violating fundamental principles of respect and fairness. The focus on the aggregate can mask real issues of equity.
That makes sense. He also raises a concern about the increasing commodification of social relationships. What's the worry there?
The danger, as Matthews sees it, is that as more and more aspects of our lives become subject to market forces, there's a risk of treating individuals as mere instruments, tools to achieve economic goals, rather than as people with inherent worth and needs.
Like cogs in a machine.
Exactly. This instrumentalization can erode the very trust and mutual obligation that are vital for a healthy society, and respect becomes a casualty in the relentless pursuit of profit and efficiency. It's like we risk forgetting the human element in our economic interactions.
So what are the potential negative consequences of this neglect of respect in our economic models and the policies that follow from them?
Matthews argues the consequences are significant and quite far-reaching. He points to increased inequality as a major outcome.
Makes sense.
When the focus is solely on individual gain, unchecked by considerations of fairness, those who already have advantages are likely to pull further ahead. This can also lead to a breakdown of trust and cooperation, making it harder to address shared challenges.
Like climate change, maybe.
Absolutely. He also highlights environmental degradation, driven by a relentless pursuit of growth without regard for ecological limits, as another consequence. And beyond that, social fragmentation, market failures. The list goes on. It paints a picture of a potentially brittle and unfair economic system.
So Matthew's central goal, then, is to put respect right at the heart of economic analysis, not as an optional extra, but as a fundamental economic principle.
Precisely. He believes that by doing so, we can pave the way for more sustainable and, crucially, more equitable economic outcomes. The subsequent chapters of his book really delve into these themes in detail, building the case that respect isn't just a moral virtue, but a core driver of how well our economies function and for whose benefit.
And that leads us directly into why respect is so vital for economic cooperation, chapter 1.3, right? It's about more than just individual self-interest bringing people together, isn't it?
Absolutely. While traditional economics often emphasizes self-interest as the engine of economic activity, Matthews contends that truly sustainable and productive cooperation goes far beyond mere calculated self-interest. It fundamentally relies on that foundation of mutual respect we just discussed.
How exactly does respect act as this foundation? What's the mechanism through which it fosters cooperation?
Matthews argues that respect is a powerful catalyst for trust. When individuals feel that their needs and perspectives are genuinely taken into account, it sends a strong signal of positive intentions and a commitment to fair dealing.
Okay.
This feeling of being respected makes people more likely to view others as trustworthy, and as a result, they become more willing to engage in cooperative endeavors. It lowers the barriers to collaboration, you could say.
And this trust, in turn, has concrete economic advantages, right? Lower costs.
Absolutely.
Right.
Trust, built upon that bedrock of respect, significantly reduces transaction costs, those expenses we incur in making economic exchanges.
Like negotiating time.
Exactly. Think about it. When there's a high degree of trust, communication becomes more efficient, negotiations are simpler because there's less suspicion of being exploited, and there's a reduced need for costly monitoring and enforcement mechanisms because people are more likely to honor their agreements.
He also illustrates how this plays out in various forms of economic cooperation, like within a company or even between nations.
Exactly. Within a company, for instance, mutual respect between employees and management cultivates a more positive and productive work environment. It boosts morale, enhances overall output. In supply chains, respectful relationships between suppliers and buyers lead to smoother operations, better quality control. And on the global stage, mutual respect between nations is essential for forging successful trade agreements and other forms of economic collaboration.
And what happens when this element of respect is missing? What are the negative economic repercussions he points out?
Well, Matthews doesn't shy away from the negative consequences. He points to things like increased social unrest, which can obviously disrupt economic activity and create instability. Systemic disrespect and the resulting inequality can severely undermine social cohesion, creating an environment that's detrimental to both businesses and individuals.
So the core message here is that respect isn't just a feel-good concept, it's actually economically essential. It's imperative.
Precisely. Matthews concludes that respect is a fundamental pillar that fosters mutually beneficial outcomes and ultimately drives sustainable economic growth. It's about recognizing that our own economic well-being is often deeply intertwined with how we treat and consider the needs of others.
Now, as we move into the middle part of On the Economics of Respect, Matthews grapples with a really big challenge. How do you actually model this concept of respect within economic interactions? It's a tricky thing to quantify, isn't it?
It is indeed a significant hurdle, trying to move beyond the traditional model of Homo economicus, who operates purely on self-interest. Matthews acknowledges this difficulty,
Yeah.
and he proposes introducing behavioral parameters that attempt to capture the value individuals place on the well-being of others.
He suggests parameters like an altruism coefficient, a reciprocity parameter, and a fairness weight. Can you give us a clearer picture of what these might represent? Maybe unpack them a little?
Certainly, the altruism coefficient, often symbolized by lambda, would essentially be a factor in someone's personal happiness equation, their utility function.
Okay.
It suggests that our own satisfaction isn't solely derived from what we consume or experience, but also, to some extent, from the well-being of others. Think of it like a kindness multiplier in your own happiness, maybe.
Interesting. And reciprocity?
The reciprocity parameter, typically rho, would aim to model how people respond to acts of kindness or unkindness. Are we more inclined to cooperate with someone who has been helpful and less so with someone who has been unfair? It captures that tit-for-tat dynamic.
Got it. And the fairness weight.
And the fairness weight alpha would represent an individual sensitivity to inequality. How much do we dislike situations where resources are distributed very unevenly? How much does unfairness bother us?
These are intriguing ideas, but as you mentioned, actually measuring these factors in the real world seems incredibly complex. How would you even put a number on someone's fairness level?
Matthews is fully aware of this challenge. He highlights the difficulty of quantifying these inherently subjective parameters. And, how do you truly put a number on someone's level of altruism or their sense of fairness?
Right.
Moreover, there's the issue of potential endogeneity, the fact that respect might influence economic outcomes, but also be shaped by them in a kind of feedback loop. It's hard to disentangle cause and effect sometimes.
So if it's so difficult to measure, why even attempt to model respect in this way? What's the value in it, according to him?
Matthews argues that even with these significant challenges, the effort is crucial. He believes that by attempting to model respect, even in a preliminary way, we can move towards a more realistic and nuanced understanding of why people make the economic choices they do.
A more human model.
Exactly. Ultimately, this could lead to the design of more effective policies that take into account these social preferences, rather than relying solely on the assumption of narrow self-interest. It's about building more human-centered economic models.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, moving on, Matthews discusses how reciprocity norms shape the way resources are allocated in Chapter 3.1. We touched on reciprocity earlier, but how does it specifically influence our access to essential resources?
What's particularly insightful here is how Matthews breaks down the different kinds of reciprocity. He describes direct reciprocity, the classic, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Simple enough.
Right.
But then he introduces indirect reciprocity, which is more about reputation. I help someone else, and someone else will likely help me in the future because they see I'm a helpful person. Reputation matters.
Okay, reputation-based.
And finally, there's generalized reciprocity, which is perhaps the most socially driven I help you and you in turn help someone else, creating a chain of goodwill without the expectation of a direct return from the person you initially helped, paying it forward, essentially.
So how does respect factor into these different types of reciprocity when it comes to obtaining the resources we need, like maybe access to common land or shared tools?
Matthews argues that respect acts as a catalyst for positive reciprocity in all its forms. When people feel respected, they are more likely to engage in those cooperative behaviors that allow for the shared access to essential resources. It fosters that crucial sense of mutual obligation that underpins all types of reciprocity.
So it greases the wheels of cooperation for resources.
You could say that. It's about creating a social environment where cooperation for resource access is the norm, rather than pure competition.
He then delves into the importance of respect in fair bargaining, Chapter 3.2. How does a bargaining process rooted in respect differ from one driven purely by self-interest when we're trying to reach an agreement?
The contrast is quite stark, actually. Bargaining driven purely by self-interest often focuses on maximizing one's own individual gain, right? And there's a constant risk of exploitation if one party holds more power.
Yeah, the stronger party wins.
A respect-based approach, on the other hand, places a strong emphasis on actively listening to the other party, genuinely trying to understand their needs and perspectives. That's where the element of empathy comes back in.
Okay.
It involves respectful communication, acknowledging any power imbalances that might exist, and striving to achieve an outcome that feels fair to everyone involved, not just maximizing your own slice of the pie.
And what are the tangible benefits of adopting this more respectful approach to bargaining? Does it actually lead to better deals?
Matthews highlights several key advantages. You're more likely to reach outcomes that are perceived as fairer by all parties, which can lead to greater satisfaction and stronger long-term relationships.
Less resentment down the line.
Exactly. It also tends to reduce conflict and the likelihood of impasses during negotiations. Ultimately, it can enhance overall social welfare and lead to agreements that are more sustainable over time because they are built on a foundation of mutual understanding and a shared commitment to fairness.
Moving on, Matthews explores altruism and resource sharing in 3.3. Altruism, acting without the expectation of direct personal gain, often seems to contradict traditional economic models. How does he integrate it into this framework of respect?
Altruism does indeed present a challenge to purely self-interested models. Matthews examines various theories that attempt to explain altruistic behavior, such as reciprocal altruism, I'll be altruistic now, hoping you'll return the favor later, and group selection theories.
Right.
However, he focuses particularly on the drivers of altruism that are closely linked to respect, empathy, our ability to understand and share the feelings of others, and our moral values, those societal norms and personal beliefs about what is right and wrong.
So the argument is that respect, by nurturing empathy and reinforcing positive moral values, can actually lead to more altruistic behavior in economic contexts, like giving to charity or volunteering.
That's precisely the argument, and he provides examples of altruistic actions that have significant economic impact, such as volunteer work and informal caregiving activities that contribute enormously to society, but are often not fully accounted for in traditional economic measures like GDP. While acknowledging the challenges to altruism, such as the potential for free-riding people taking advantage of others' generosity, Matthews concludes that an economics of respect needs to incorporate both altruism and reciprocity to foster a more cooperative and caring society.
Now let's turn to respect and property rights in Chapter 3.4. Traditionally, the theory of property rights often focuses on efficiency, who owns what, and how can resources be used most productively. How does Matthews bring in this additional layer of respect?
Matthews argues that respect introduces the crucial dimension of equitable distribution to the traditional focus on efficiency and property rights. He points out that a system solely concerned with maximizing efficient use of resources can have significant downsides.
Watch as.
Well, it can overlook who ultimately benefits and who bears the costs, potentially widening existing inequalities, and it can even lead to unfair contracts when there are substantial power imbalances between parties. Think historical land deals, for instance.
So how does respect provide a basis for making property rights more equitable? What does that look like?
Respect, Matthews suggests, provides a moral foundation for reforming property rights. It acknowledges that everyone has a legitimate claim to a minimum level of resources necessary for basic survival and well-being, regardless of their economic power or starting position.
Okay.
This line of thinking leads to the consideration of respect-driven mechanisms, such as progressive taxation, social welfare programs, maybe even land reform in some contexts, as ways to redistribute resources more fairly. It also involves recognizing the property rights of marginalized communities, like indigenous populations, and taking into account environmental protection as part of property rights.
Of course, figuring out what constitutes equitable distribution and how to implement these kinds of reforms without unintended negative consequences, like disincentivizing work, must be a significant challenge.
Absolutely. Matthews acknowledges these inherent difficulties defining what equitable truly means in practice, considering the potential effects of redistribution on incentives to work and invest, and the often considerable political obstacles involved in implementing such changes.
It's not easy.
No, but his overarching point is that a respect-based approach to property rights strives for a society that is not only prosperous, but also just and sustainable through principles of reciprocity and mutual consideration.
Unfortunately, the absence of respect can lead to some really negative outcomes, particularly when it comes to how we use and manage resources, as Matthews discusses in his section on resource depletion and conflict, Chapter 3.5.
Yes, this is where the detrimental effects of a lack of respect become very clear, very stark. Matthews illustrates how a failure to respect the needs of others and the limits of the natural environment can lead to overexploitation of resources.
Like overfishing or deforestation.
Exactly. And a disregard for long-term consequences. Practices like land grabbing that disregard existing rights, and unequal access to essential resources like clean water. It's a short-sighted approach driven by immediate self-interest without consideration for the broader impact.
And this disrespectful approach to resource management can actually be a driver of conflict.
Absolutely. When people feel their fundamental needs are ignored and their rights are violated in the competition for scarce resources, it can easily escalate into conflict. Matthews details how disrespectful resource allocation can fuel resource-based conflicts, environmental disputes, disagreements over property rights, and even broader social unrest. It creates a climate of tension and instability.
So, what's the way to break out of this destructive cycle, according to Matthews?
Matthews emphasizes that the key lies in a fundamental shift towards more respectful and reciprocal ways of allocating resources. This involves establishing inclusive governance structures where all stakeholders have a voice.
Not just the powerful ones.
Precisely. Strengthening property rights, especially for marginalized communities who are often most vulnerable to resource exploitation, and investing in sustainable management practices that take into account the long-term well-being of both people and the planet.
Now let's explore how respect plays a crucial role in the smooth functioning of markets by reducing what economists refer to as transaction costs. Chapter 4.1. How does this work in practice?
Think of transaction costs as all the friction that exists in markets. The time and money spent on things like negotiating deals, ensuring that people adhere to agreements, monitoring contracts, and resolving any disputes that arise.
All the hassle involved in doing business.
Exactly. Matthews argues that respect acts like a lubricant in the system, reducing this friction by fostering trust and cooperation between economic actors.
So if people have a greater sense of trust in each other because there's an underlying foundation of respect, what are the specific ways this leads to lower transaction costs?
He points to several key ways. Respect streamlines the processes of bargaining and negotiation because people are more likely to approach each other with fairness and a willingness to listen. This leads to quicker and more mutually agreeable solutions.
And less need for lawyers.
Potentially, yes. It reduces the need for expensive and time-consuming legal battles. It also minimizes the need for extensive monitoring and enforcement mechanisms. When there's a prevailing sense of mutual respect and obligation, individuals and organizations are more likely to honor their commitments without constant oversight or the threat of penalties.
Matthews then discusses the power of a respectful reputation in 4.2. How does being known as someone who consistently treats others with consideration translate into tangible economic advantages?
A reputation for respect acts as a powerful signal of trustworthiness. If people know that you consistently take the needs and perspectives of others into account in your economic dealings, they are far more likely to see you as a reliable and dependable partner in future transactions.
So it opens doors.
It certainly does. This reduces the perceived risk of engaging with you and encourages others to seek you out for cooperative ventures, maybe even offering better terms because they trust you more.
And this reputation for respect can create a positive feedback loop, reinforcing itself over time, right? A virtuous cycle.
Exactly. Matthews describes it as the interplay between reputation and reciprocity, creating a virtuous cycle. When you consistently act respectfully, you're more likely to be treated with respect in return, which further enhances your positive reputation and reinforces your inclination to continue acting respectfully. It's a self-sustaining process that builds strong and mutually beneficial relationships over the long term.
Of course, building a strong reputation takes time and effort, and there can be challenges like incomplete information in the marketplace. You don't always know who you're dealing with.
Precisely. Information asymmetry, where one party in a transaction has more knowledge than the other, can make it difficult to accurately assess someone's reputation. Is their respectful behavior genuine or just for show?
Right.
And as you pointed out, it requires a sustained investment in ethical practices and transparent communication to build and maintain a positive reputation over time. It's not something that can be faked easily, or at least not forever.
Matthews also suggests that respect can function as a kind of informal enforcement mechanism, Chapter 4.3, a way to ensure people follow through on their agreements without having to rely solely on costly legal processes.
That's a really insightful point. While formal legal sanctions certainly play a crucial role, relying exclusively on them has its limitations. the cost of litigation, the damage it can do to relationships.
It can destroy goodwill.
Absolutely. Plus, contracts can never cover every possible contingency, and there are potential gaps in enforcement. A strong culture of respect, where people feel a moral obligation to uphold their commitments and want to preserve their reputation for fairness, can actually significantly reduce the likelihood of opportunistic behavior, even in the absence of an immediate legal threat. Social pressure matters.
And going back to the issue of information, he argues that respect can help to bridge those gaps where one party has more knowledge than the other, what's known as information asymmetry, chapter 4.4.
Yes, information asymmetry can severely undermine trust and efficiency in markets. If you think the other person knows something you don't, you're naturally wary.
True.
However, respect fosters an environment of transparency and encourages more open communication. When individuals feel valued and their concerns are taken seriously, they are more likely to share information honestly and freely, even if it involves disclosing something that might seem counter to their immediate self-interest.
He even provides a compelling example of this with the development of open source software. How does it illustrate the role of respect in information sharing?
What's remarkable about the open source movement is how it thrives on widespread collaboration, radical transparency in the code, and a deep respect for the contributions of individual developers. Anyone can see the code, suggest changes, point out flaws.
It's all out in the open.
Exactly. The very open nature of the process minimizes information asymmetry, allowing for continuous peer review, improvement, and innovation driven by this shared respect for knowledge and collective effort. It's built on trust and transparency.
Of course, respect alone isn't always sufficient, and sometimes we still need those more formal mechanisms like government regulations and independent audits to ensure accountability, right? Chapter 4.4 acknowledges limits.
Absolutely. While respect is undoubtedly a powerful force, Matthews acknowledges that it's not a universal panacea. In certain situations, particularly where significant power imbalances exist, or the potential for harm is high, think finance or environmental regulation, those more formal oversight mechanisms remain necessary to ensure adequate information disclosure and to protect vulnerable parties. Respect complements, but doesn't always replace, regulation.
To really illustrate these abstract ideas, Matthews includes several compelling case studies of respect in action in Chapter 4.5. Let's begin with the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation in Spain. What makes it such a powerful example in this context?
Mondragon, this federation of worker cooperatives, really stands out as a real-world example of a large-scale economic enterprise built on the core principles of respect and cooperation.
How so?
Well, unlike traditional corporations primarily focused on maximizing shareholder profit, Mondragon prioritizes worker ownership, democratic governance. The workers have a real say and a deep respect for the dignity and well-being of its workforce.
And has it been successful?
Remarkably so. What's particularly significant is its long track record of sustainable economic success and resilience, even when facing challenging economic conditions in Spain and globally. It suggests this model can work.
Next, he examines the example of fair trade coffee cooperatives. How do they embody the economics of respect in their operations?
The fair trade movement, particularly in the coffee sector, vividly demonstrates how respect-based practices can lead to significantly improved market outcomes for marginalized producers in developing countries.
It's about fairness for the farmers?
Fundamentally, yes. It's about establishing direct trading relationships, cutting out some exploitative middlemen, ensuring fair prices that cover the costs of sustainable production and provide a living wage for farmers, and empowering producers through democratic cooperatives.
And does it work?
Numerous studies have documented the positive impact of fair trade on incomes and living standards for these farmers. And it suggests that consumers are often willing to pay a premium to support ethically produced goods, showing a form of respect for the producers.
He also takes a look at the Amish economy, which seems quite different. What can we learn about the role of respect from their way of life and economic activities?
The Amish community, with its strong emphasis on traditional values and a commitment to a simpler way of life, offers a unique example of an economy deeply rooted in mutual aid, cooperation, and a profound respect for community norms.
Community seems key.
Very much so. Core principles like Gelassenheit, which emphasizes yieldedness or submission to the community, and Gemeinschaft, the strong sense of community spirit, permeate their economic activities. This leads to remarkable resilience in the face of external economic pressures. Their focus on self-sufficiency and mutual support provides a compelling alternative model, challenging our usual assumptions.
And finally, in this section, he revisits open source software development, this time specifically as a case study. What key aspects of respect does it highlight in action?
The open source software movement powerfully underscores the impact of respect for knowledge, collaborative spirit, and the principle of reciprocity, as we touched on earlier.
How so?
Developers from around the globe contribute their valuable time and expertise, often without direct monetary compensation. They're driven by factors such as social recognition within the community, earning respect, and a shared commitment to the creation of a common good. The profound impact of this model on technological innovation clearly demonstrates how intrinsic motivation and mutual respect can drive significant productivity and progress.
Moving into the later sections of On the Economics of Respect, Matthews connects his core ideas to broader concepts of justice and equality. He brings in the work of philosopher John Rawls and his difference principle in Chapter 5.1. Can you explain what that principle entails and how it relates to the idea of respect?
Sure. John Rawls' difference principle essentially states that social and economic inequalities are permissible only if they're arranged so that they are to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society.
Only if they help the worst off.
Exactly. The underlying justification for this principle rests on the idea of fairness, imagining ourselves behind a veil of ignorance where we don't know our own future position in society. Rich, poor, talented, etc.
The original position thought experiment.
Right. In such a hypothetical state, Rawls argues, we would rationally choose principles of justice that prioritize the well-being of the most vulnerable because, well, we ourselves might end up in that position.
So how does Matthews connect this to respect?
Matthews connects this to respect by arguing that the difference principle embodies a fundamental respect for the inherent worth and needs of all members of society, particularly those who are struggling. It's about creating a system where everyone has a stake in societal progress, where inequalities aren't just accepted, but are justified only if they lift the bottom up.
So at its heart, the difference principle is about showing respect for the least fortunate in society by ensuring that inequalities ultimately work to their benefit. It's structural respect, almost.
That's a core element of it, yes. It's about constructing a society where everyone has a real opportunity to thrive, and that necessitates paying particular attention to the needs and circumstances of those who are most disadvantaged. It shifts the focus from simply maximizing overall wealth to ensuring a more just distribution of benefits.
Conversely, Matthews argues in 5.2 that a lack of respect or disrespect is a significant driver of inequality. How does this manifest itself in economic and social systems?
Disrespect in this context often manifests as various forms of discrimination and exclusion. Matthews details how discrimination based on factors like race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, or social class can operate in labor markets.
Hiring, pay gaps.
Exactly. And in housing, education, access to finance, even the justice system, limiting opportunities and perpetuating disadvantage for certain groups.
And exclusion.
He also discusses different types of exclusion. Social exclusion, being ostracized. Economic exclusion, lack of access to jobs or credit. And political marginalization, lacking a voice, that prevents certain groups from fully participating in society.
And this has psychological effects, too.
Absolutely. The experience of ongoing disrespect can have profound psychological consequences, eroding self-esteem, fostering internalized depression, leading to chronic stress and poorer health outcomes, and contributing to a cycle of disadvantage that's hard to break.
So, addressing the deep-rooted problem of inequality requires actively challenging and dismantling the various forms of disrespect that underpin it. It's not just about economics.
Absolutely. Matthews outlines a range of strategies, including the implementation and enforcement of anti-discrimination laws, the adoption of affirmative action programs to address historical disadvantages, public education and awareness campaigns to challenge prejudice and stereotypes, and concerted efforts to promote diversity and inclusion across all sectors of society. These are all crucial steps in tackling disrespect and fostering a more equitable society where everyone is treated with dignity and has the opportunity to reach their full potential.
He then turns his attention to respect-based social safety nets in Chapter 5.3. How does a focus on respect reshape how we think about and design these crucial programs, like welfare or unemployment benefits?
The key shift is moving beyond simply providing basic material assistance, just handing out money or food, to ensuring that social safety net programs are designed and delivered in a way that affirms the inherent dignity and worth of individuals receiving support.
How do you do that?
Matthews emphasizes core principles such as adequacy of support is enough to live on, the preservation of dignity for recipients, avoiding humiliating processes, inclusivity in program design and access, are they easy to use for everyone, opportunities for participation where possible, giving people agency, and the crucial importance of confidentiality.
And prioritizing certain groups.
Yes, respect-based safety nets prioritize support for vulnerable populations, including children, the elderly, people with disabilities, single-parent families, and marginalized ethnic or racial groups, with the aim of empowering them rather than reinforcing stigma or dependency.
And the impact of these programs should be measured not just in terms of economic indicators like poverty rates, but also in terms of psychological and social well-being.
Precisely. Matthews stresses the importance of evaluating the effectiveness of social safety nets by looking beyond purely economic metrics to include indicators of mental health, social connectedness, feelings of self-worth, and overall life satisfaction. The goal is not just to alleviate poverty, but to foster a sense of belonging and respect for all members of society.
It's clear that respect plays a fundamental role in these social support systems, and Matthews also argues that it's absolutely vital in areas like healthcare, 5.4, and education, 5.5.
Indeed. In healthcare, respect acts as a crucial gateway to access. Think about cultural sensitivity, language barriers. Respect helps overcome those. It fosters trust between patients and providers.
Which is huge for adherence to treatment.
Exactly. It promotes active patient engagement in their own care and ultimately enhances the quality of treatment through better communication and shared decision-making.
And the lack of it.
Conversely, a lack of respect in healthcare settings, feeling dismissed, not listened to, facing bias can lead to medical mistrust, patients avoiding care, poorer health outcomes, and significant disparities in care between different groups.
And education, similar logic.
Very similar. In education, respect is foundational to creating a positive and equitable learning environment where all students feel valued, safe, and supported. Disrespect, whether through discriminatory practices by staff or peers, underfunding of schools in certain communities, or curricula that don't reflect diverse experiences, can have a devastating impact on educational access and outcomes, limiting life chances. Promoting respect here means equitable resources, inclusive teaching, anti-bias training, and listening to students.
To delve deeper into the psychological foundations of his arguments, Matthews revisits some classic experiments from behavioral economics in Chapter 6.2, specifically the ultimatum game and the dictator game. What do the results of these games tell us about the importance of respect and fairness in our decision-making?
These games provide really valuable insights into motivations that go beyond purely self-interested behavior, challenging that simple Homo economicus model again.
How does the ultimatum game work?
In the ultimatum game, one player, the proposer, gets a sum of money, say $10, and has to propose a split with a second player, the responder. The responder can either accept the offer, and they both get the proposed amounts, or reject it, and neither player gets anything.
So if the proposer offers $1 and keeps $9, the responder might reject it even though $1 is better than $0.
Exactly. And that's what often happens. Proposers typically offer a significant portion, often close to half, and responders frequently reject low offers, like maybe 20% or less. Matthews interprets this as strong evidence that people have a concern for fairness and are willing to punish what they perceive as disrespectful or unfair behavior, even at a cost to themselves.
Okay, and the dictator game?
The dictator game is even simpler. One player, the dictator, gets a sum of money and simply decides how much, if any, to give to the other player, who has no say. There's no strategic reason to give anything.
Pure self-interest says keep it all.
Right. But the consistent finding is that dictators often give away a non-zero amount, sometimes quite a bit. Matthews sees this as evidence for genuine altruism, or at least strong fairness considerations that aren't captured by traditional economic models of pure self-interest. People seem to care about others' outcomes.
And these behaviors are now being studied at the level of brain activity through the field of neuroeconomics, Chapter 6.4. What are some of the key findings in that area that relate to respect and social preferences?
Neuroeconomic studies using fMRI and other brain imaging techniques have identified specific brain regions that become active when we process fairness and engage in reciprocal behavior. It's fascinating stuff.
Like what regions?
For instance, the anterior insula, a region often associated with negative emotions like disgust or pain, tends to activate in response to unfair offers in the ultimatum game, like our brain is literally registering unfairness as unpleasant. The striatum, a key part of the brain's reward system, lights up when we receive fair treatment or when we successfully reciprocate kind actions. Fairness feels good. The oxytocin system, often linked to bonding and trust, also plays a role in cooperative behavior.
And other areas, too.
Yes, areas like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex involved in regulating responses, the anterior cingulate cortex linked to empathy and social pain, and the temporoparietal junction involved in perspective taking. What's particularly significant is that these findings challenge the notion that we are solely driven by our own material gain. They suggest we derive psychological utility, pleasure, or pain from how others are treated and from the fairness of the situation itself.
So it's not just a matter of cold, rational calculation. Our brains seem to be wired at least partly for a sense of fairness and social connection. It's biological.
That's a crucial takeaway from neuroeconomics, yes. Our emotions and social preferences, including our sense of fairness and our capacity for empathy, play a much more significant role in our economic decision-making than traditional models often acknowledge. Respect and fairness seem to have biological roots.
Matthews then explores the critical role of empathy and social norms in Chapter 6.5, motivating behavior that goes beyond narrow self-interest. How do these factors influence our economic choices and interactions?
Empathy, both cognitive empathy, understanding another's perspective, and emotional empathy, sharing their feelings, can be a powerful motivator for a range of economic behaviors. Think about ethical consumption choices, buying fair trade, avoiding sweatshops.
Or impact investing, wanting your money to do good.
Exactly. Or supporting social entrepreneurship. Empathy drives these. And social norms, those shared expectations within a community about how we should behave, can often override our immediate self-interest, particularly when there are social sanctions like disapproval or gossip for violating those norms. We care about what others think of us. We want to fit in.
And can we actually leverage our understanding of social norms to encourage more respectful behavior? He talks about nudging respect in 6.6.
That's the central idea behind nudging, drawing on behavioral science. By making subtle changes in the way choices are presented, what's known as choice architecture, we can gently guide people towards more pro-social behaviors without forbidding other options.
How might that work for respect or fairness?
Well, you could highlight the fair outcomes of certain actions and negotiations. You might structure choices in a way that encourages more equitable allocation of resources by default. Or you could frame decisions related to sustainability in a way that emphasizes the long-term consequences for future generations or vulnerable communities, tapping into empathy and norms of responsibility. It's about making the respectful choice the easier or more salient choice.
In Part 7 of On the Economics of Respect, Matthews broadens the scope and looks at empathetic economies through a comparative lens, examining different models and philosophies around the world. Let's touch on a few. He starts with Scandinavian social democracies. 7.1. What characteristics make them potentially illustrative of respect-based welfare models?
The Scandinavian model, countries like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, is often cited. It has a strong emphasis on a universal welfare state, providing comprehensive social support, healthcare, education, pensions.
High taxes, but lots of services.
Right. Plus active labor market policies aimed at full employment, robust social dialogue between labor and capital, progressive taxation systems designed to reduce income inequality, and a high value placed on education and rehabilitative justice. It's often seen as being rooted in a culture of trust and a strong sense of social solidarity or shared responsibility.
So, a historical emphasis on equality reflects respect.
Arguably, yes. There's a historical emphasis on reducing disparities and providing equal opportunities, which Matthews suggests reflects a deep-seated respect for the well-being of all citizens, regardless of their socioeconomic status.
He also examines the Ubuntu philosophy in African economies, 7.2. What are the key principles of Ubuntu, and how do they relate to economics?
Ubuntu is a deeply ingrained philosophy in many southern and sub-Saharan African cultures. It emphasizes the interconnectedness of humanity. I am because we are, communal harmony, and the inherent dignity of each individual.
How does that play out economically?
This translates into an economic ethic that prioritizes communalism, empathy, reciprocity in social economic interactions, inclusivity in decision-making, and a shared responsibility for the well-being of the entire community. We see manifestations of this in traditional resource allocation practices, informal savings groups like Stockvilles, and cooperative enterprises that prioritize community benefit.
And what about East Asian collectivism, 7.3? How does the emphasis on collectivism in some East Asian economies relate to the principles of respect discussed in the book?
East Asian societies, often influenced by Confucian values, so this is a huge generalization, of course, tend to prioritize the needs and well-being of the group over purely individual desires. There's often a strong emphasis on respect for social hierarchy and the pursuit of social harmony, sometimes called wa in Japan.
And economically.
This collectivist ethos, has significant implications for economic behavior, often leading to a focus on long-term planning, the development of strong social safety nets. Though, importantly, these can sometimes coexist with significant inequalities based on gender or status, and a preference for cooperation and consensus building over open conflict in economic interactions. Respect for the group and its stability is key.
Finally, in this comparative section, Matthews looks at indigenous economies, 7.4. What are some of the key characteristics of these economies that reflect a respect-based approach?
Indigenous economies around the world, despite their vast diversity, often offer compelling examples of economic systems that are fundamentally rooted in principles of reciprocity, a deep respect for the natural world, often seeing it as kin, not just a resource, and a long-term perspective that prioritizes sustainability and the well-being of the community as a whole over the accumulation of individual wealth.
So respect for nature and community are central.
Very often, yes. Economic practices are often closely intertwined with environmental conservation efforts and the transmission of traditional ecological knowledge across generations. The focus is frequently on balance and stewardship rather than maximum extraction.
Moving into part 8, the focus shifts to respect and sustainable growth. He discusses respect for future generations and the concept of intergenerational equity, 8.1. What are the key aspects of this idea?
Intergenerational equity is essentially about fairness between the generations. It asks, are the economic and environmental decisions we make today compromising the well-being and opportunities available to those who will live in the future?
Are we leaving them a mess?
Basically, yes. Respect for future generations demands that we take responsible action on issues like climate change, manage resources sustainably, avoid excessive debt burdens, and make sustainable investments in things like education, healthcare, and infrastructure, fostering social capital that will benefit those who come after us. It's about looking beyond immediate gains and considering the long-term consequences.
He also discusses environmental stewardship, 8.2, as being deeply connected to respect for natural resources. What's the underlying philosophy here?
The concept of environmental stewardship, which emphasizes the responsible use and protection of the natural environment, stems from recognizing the intrinsic value of ecosystems and biodiversity, independent of their immediate economic utility to us. It's not just about what nature can do for us.
So respecting nature for its own sake.
Exactly. A respect-based approach to the environment prioritizes principles of sustainability. The precautionary principle, being cautious when impacts are uncertain, meaningful engagement with all stakeholders, including local communities, and a recognition of our responsibility to protect the natural world for its own sake and for future generations. It connects to valuing ecosystem services, internalizing externalities like pollution, and integrating indigenous knowledge.
Then there's the crucial concept of inclusive growth, 8.3, and the importance of showing respect for marginalized communities. What does this entail in an economic context?
Inclusive growth is about ensuring that all segments of society, particularly those who have historically been marginalized or excluded due to race, gender, disability, location, etc., are able to fully participate in and benefit from economic development. It's the opposite of growth that leaves people behind.
How does respect enable this?
Respect in this context requires several things: the recognition of their rights, dignity, and specific needs, the redistribution of opportunities and resources to address existing inequalities through things like targeted investments, their meaningful representation in economic and political decision-making processes, giving them a voice, efforts towards reconciliation for past injustices where relevant, and the active removal of systemic barriers in education, finance, employment that prevent their full inclusion.
Finally, in this section on sustainable growth, Matthews touches on respect-based innovation, 8.4, and the development of sustainable technologies. What's the ethical imperative here?
The ethical imperative for respect-based innovation lies in recognizing that the technologies we develop and promote should strive to minimize negative environmental impacts, advance social equity, and address the long-term needs of humanity, not just short-term profits or convenience.
So, thinking about the broader consequences of tech.
Precisely. It's about embracing a holistic approach to innovation that considers the interconnectedness of economic, social, and environmental systems. This often incorporates principles of the circular economy, reducing waste, reusing materials, prioritizes accessibility, and ensures social inclusivity in the design and deployment of new technologies, asking who benefits and who might be harmed.
And he connects all this to policy frameworks like the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, in 8.5.
Yes, he argues that embedding respect is crucial for achieving the SDGs. This involves mainstreaming respect considerations across all goals, using participatory approaches that involve affected communities, promoting education for sustainable development and global citizenship, and recognizing how respect is fundamental to goals related to poverty, hunger, health, education, inequality, environment, and peace.
In Part 9, Matthews returns to some of his earlier case studies to examine them through the lens of global economics. We revisit Mondragon, 9.1, Grameen Bank, 9.2, emphasizing its respect for the poor and trust-based lending.
Yes, highlighting its focus on women, client-centric approach, and collateral-free loans based on group trust.
The Amish economy, 9.3, again, challenging conventional assumptions about growth, and fair trade organizations, 9.4, detailing their principles and impact.
Right, reinforcing how these models work on a larger scale, despite challenges like market share for fair trade.
He also introduces the nation of Bhutan and its unique focus on gross national happiness, GNH, as a model of respectful development, 9.5.
Exactly. Bhutan explicitly prioritizes well-being across multiple dimensions: sustainable development, cultural preservation, environmental conservation, and good governance, sometimes even over pure economic growth, GDP. Matthews presents it as a national policy framework reflecting deep respect for culture, environment, and holistic well-being.
These revisited and new case studies powerfully illustrate the practical applications of the economics of respect in diverse contexts across the globe, don't they?
They really do. They demonstrate how prioritizing mutual consideration and well-being can lead to innovative and sustainable solutions to complex economic and social challenges, moving beyond theory into practice.
Finally, in Part 10, Matthews considers the challenge of scaling respect to the global level, Chapter 10.5, discussing the need for stronger global governance and more effective international cooperation. What are some of the key considerations on this scale?
Matthews argues that scaling respect to the global level requires tackling some major issues. First, addressing significant power imbalances between nations in trade negotiations, international finance, etc.
So rich countries don't just dictate terms.
Exactly. Second, promoting greater policy coherence across different international organizations, like the WTO, World Bank, UN agencies, so they aren't working at cross purposes. And third, fostering a global ethic of reciprocity, where the needs and perspectives of all nations, especially poorer and more vulnerable ones, are genuinely taken into account.
And how might this apply in specific areas?
Well, he suggests this has direct implications for promoting fairer trade practices, encouraging more responsible international investment, like avoiding exploitation of labor or environment, pursuing climate justice that addresses the disproportionate impacts of climate change on vulnerable nations who contributed least to the problem, and prioritizing biodiversity conservation while respecting the knowledge and rights of indigenous communities who often steward those resources.
So, as we bring our deep dive into On the Economics of Respect to a close, what are the fundamental takeaways from Matthew's work? What's the core message?
The central argument, as we have explored in quite some detail, is that respect is not merely a desirable social virtue, but a foundational economic principle. It's fundamental.
Not just nice, but necessary.
Precisely. It is the bedrock upon which trust and cooperation are built. It reduces the frictions of transaction costs, making economies run more smoothly. It fosters innovation, particularly the collaborative kind. And ultimately, Matthews argues powerfully, it leads to more equitable and sustainable economic outcomes.
And the book pulls evidence from lots of places.
Yes, the book's interdisciplinary approach, drawing on economics, philosophy, psychology, sociology, neuroeconomics, and these compelling real-world examples powerfully reinforces this central thesis.
And as a final thought for our listener, what's one key question or idea you'd want them to ponder after this deep dive? Something to take away.
Well, given the compelling argument that economies truly flourish when there is due consideration for the needs of others, maybe the question is, what is one small but meaningful change that you could make in your own daily economic interactions?
As a consumer, maybe. Or a worker.
Exactly. Whether as a consumer, an employee, an employer, an investor, or simply as a participant in your local community, what small shift could contribute to a more respectful and ultimately maybe a more prosperous and sustainable world for everyone?
How does seeing the economy through this lens change things for us individually?
Yeah, just consider how this perspective might shift your understanding of our economic systems and your own potential agency, your own power to influence them, even in small ways. It's food for thought, isn't it?